Welcome, Western Standard viewers. I think all of us have rolled our eyes at some time or other in the last few years over the stupidities of woke. But woke can be very personal and it can be very devastating. I have with me today a young man who has lived it and fled the country to get away from it. And of all the places to go to, he's gone to a communist country because he finds life easier there as an academic than he does in Canada. I'd like to introduce to you Eldon Brock. Eldon, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
How is it in Hanoi today?
We have Joe Biden visiting today, so there's a lot of blocked roads in the city. Traffic is especially bad today.
Yes, the 100-car motorcade. Okay.
Yeah.
Brock, your story, and I'm just going to ask you to tell it, but basically you went to university in Canada, got a degree, studied overseas, then went to Queen's University, and a lot of things came unglued. You thought that the same professional standards, the same standards of integrity and the quality of the professors and the rigor of the scholarship would all still be there, but you found otherwise. Tell us about it.
Beginning in Queens in 2016 to 2017, I had begun a master's degree planning on pursuing a PhD. I've been a writer my whole life. It was my dream as a BA student to be able to establish myself in a position in the university. I went as a shirked scholarship student. I wasn't allowed to write about what I wanted to write about, which was American revolutionary novels. I wasn't encouraged to, in any case. When we're defining this term woke, it's essentially shut down of anything that goes against a postmodern Marxist agenda that is being pushed down children's throats like forced pills. It's a highly dangerous doctrine that swaps out the economics from Marxism with identity categories like race, like gender, and so on. I found the classroom policies were quite shocking to me after having spent so much time overseas. I'd spent time in South Korea, Beijing, Vietnam. I was quite shocked that it was impossible to question this content and that it resembled so closely what I'd seen 10-year-olds learning in 3 hours in Beijing. The resemblance was uncanny, so it was immediately alerting.
So, with the what does it actually feel like to be in class? I mean, how do they? You were told you couldn't write about what you wanted to write about. Okay, so what, did they tell you what you must write about, and how did the classroom discussions go?
We weren't explicitly told what we had to write about, but we knew what we had to write about. I took a very traditional as possible course of study because I wanted a wide breadth as a student of English language and literature to be able to teach later in my career. But it became impossible to avoid with 2/3 of the classes consisting of courses without time periods, without authors, Black Lives Matter, the refugee crisis, indigenous masculinities. These courses overwhelmed the course listing to the point where it bled into everything else. And you asked about the feeling. Particularly after my experiences in communist countries, it was incredibly anxiety inducing. And I don't think that most of the students knew exactly what was going on, but there was a general sense of dread and guilt instilled by the professors again and again. And how you earned a grade was by writing about oppression. Whoever managed to write about oppression covering the most number of groups to the highest extent got the highest grade, but no one got a grade lower than 80% or an A minus. So it was impossible to distinguish between quality work attempting to pursue a PhD when the feedback equalized everything. And that's part of this Marxist equity agenda.
You're saying everybody got an A minus?
Everybody got an A minus at least.
So
and everybody got an A, in fact. Can you repeat your question?
I said, what about the people who couldn't write or came up with a different point of view?
The people who couldn't write. I listened to a lot of papers. They're listed in my piece. Topics, mandatory presentations by academics as well, which we were told to model from. Queerness and ice hockey, the niqab and the geopolitics of the face. As long as you addressed those moral points, it didn't matter if you could write.
This is very surprising stuff. Now, I know that you're going to be writing a lengthy piece for our friends at C2C on this.
Mm-hmm.
This is how I first came to hear about it and was intrigued by your story. But I know in the preview of what I saw that you talked about a talking stick. What the hell's that?
A talking stick. So this was one of these classroom policies that became mandated. All of these things were mandatory. They were not in school documents, but the professors were enforcing rules like in this Indigenous gender studies class, the professor requiring us to introduce ourselves by our preferred pronouns. The stick went around. We had to talk about our background connection to feminism, and we were not permitted to speak in class after that unless we had asked for the stick.
Sure. Okay.
So in a classroom of MA and PhD students, you could not interject. You had to politely ask for a stick, and that it softened the environment so much that you couldn't disagree. It was a very, very strange environment.
So free discussion was out.
Free discussion was absolutely out.
Was there anything particular that made you, I'm getting out of here, I'm going somewhere else, I'm going to start looking? What happened?
I think I knew I had to finish the degree. As I said, it had been my dream since I was a high school student and wanted to become a writer. That's one of the few ways I could afford a living as a writer, was to be institutionalized in a university.
Mm-hmm.
Why did I come to Vietnam? Was why I came to Vietnam. I'd been in Vietnam for a year before starting the degree. I'd been in Korea prior to that, and I was constantly, it was like I was physically in one place, mentally in the other, realizing that I was much more free as a writer in Vietnam as opposed to Canada.
Well, how can that be? It's a communist country.
How can that be? Because
people
they have
fled from Vietnam and came to Canada. They're boat people. I mean, this is turning the world upside down. Can you explain that?
Yes, they have a strong foundation in science, and they believe in biological reality. They're not terrifying their children with environmental doomsday propaganda on a daily basis. And the city, Hanoi, it changes every day. It's getting better and better every day. And the restrictions on speech are there, but they're very clear, and it is for the purpose of national union that speech is restricted. Most of the censorship involves keeping the North and South intact and not continually on the attack with one another.
So I think there are politicians in this country who might also argue for limitations on free speech in the interests of national unity. How is it that you find it congenial in Vietnam when in Canada, I think you would probably, well, in fact, you fled it. So,
yeah, I would certainly disagree in Canada. Vietnam is a generation away now from a horrific war on all sides, but I think that in the Vietnamese case, it's too raw. You don't want constant civil war, and as long as people are thriving and they're happy, and you're giving them freedom to live out their lives in a common sense way, in that sense, I think it brings me to tears. It brought me to tears thinking about living in a country where common sense, science, logic, reason, skill were tossed out the window and needlessly replaced by this Marxist ideology.
Okay, let me stop you there for a second. Marxist ideology, yes, that's what wokeism is, and we've got it in Canada in spades. Hanoi, Vietnam, communist country, Marxist, communist. Are they woke?
Absolutely not. And my students, I've worked at a number of international companies which are peddling this stuff to developing countries like Vietnam, developing one-party state countries like Vietnam, and it's not working because the people have this scientific rational foundation. The arts aren't particularly thriving, at least in a culturally dominant sense, but they aren't in Canada either. I think that when I've presented materials that I would classify as woke, the general response from students has been disbelief.
Really?
Shock. Yes, absolutely.
Well, I believe you've found personal happiness in Vietnam. You're married. You have children?
Yes, I have a daughter, 9 months old.
Okay. Well, one day she's going to be, God willing, she's going to be looking at what she's going to do with her life. And she's going to ask you what you think she should do. Will you recommend a university education to her? And if so, where?
Not in the current state of the universities in Canada. Absolutely not. I think, and that goes for most of the West. I think it's infecting STEM now. It's so pervasive that it's not nourishing thought. It suffocates thought. Well, would I encourage her to go to a university in Canada? Absolutely not. I would encourage her to read and learn how to do things with her hands, not a Canadian university.
Last question, Eldon.
Mhm.
You said just now that Western companies were peddling woke materials.
Mhm.
I think it is only Western companies that peddle woke materials, and primarily to the United States, Canada, Australia, Great Britain, maybe in the
Mhm.
European countries too, I'm not sure. Why do you think that this particular philosophy is being directed to those countries and not to naturally what one would think would be a naturally warm, welcoming reception? It's a communist country. Why are we picked out to get all the nonsense?
I think it's a lack of historical awareness. First off, I know from my experience at Queen's that as a high school student, I learned nothing about the Cultural Revolution in China. I learned nothing about the Russian Revolution or Pol Pot's Cambodia. I think it's historical ignorance. And why is Canada being singled out? I think that's a challenging question, but I wouldn't say I just don't think Canada can withstand it because of its reliance on group identities from the start. English, French, Indigenous. It is founded on group identities. So it's particularly bad in Canada because we have this sensitivity already about the collective. We are not one collective in our political discourse. It is a fractured struggle for power, which is the perfect it's the perfect place for an ideology like this to take root, because it's all about taking down merit, history, and it's not a compassionate ideology. It is about revenge. And if you look at the history of communism, it does not equalize things in any other sense than that it brings people to the bottom. I think that we're at risk in Canada because we have that immediately, this idea of group rights and groups in conflict as being so predominant in our political narrative in my lifetime, at least.
I think that's tremendously insightful, Brock. Ladies and gentlemen, Brock Eldon, a man from a small town near Owen Sound who has tried the education system in Canada, found it oppressive, and took himself to what we all thought was an oppressive country, Vietnam, and found more academic freedom there. Fascinating tale. Can't wait to read the full. We'll have an extract from your C2C article in the Western Standard. And really appreciate you taking the time this morning, Brock. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. Take care.
You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited access.